The year was 1987, and Three Men and a Baby was the top-grossing movie in America. The Bangles Walk Like an Egyptian was burning up the pop charts, and people were losing their minds over disposable contact lenses. 1987 was also the year a lot of your favorite video games were getting their start. And today I want to talk about 30 games celebrating their 30th anniversary in 2017. From classic NES games, to the arcade, to the Master System, here are some of the biggest games released in 1987. This was a big year for arcade games, with many of your favorite series getting their start in 1987. This includes the original Street Fighter, which hit arcades on August 30th. While not a great fighting game, you can see the beginnings of what would become the hallmarks of the long-running franchise. Perhaps the least surprising fact is, after 30 years, Capcom has only managed to count a Street Fighter V. 1987 also gave us Contra. No, not the NES game everybody loves, but the far less exciting arcade game. It spawned a whole bunch of sequels, including the incredible Contra 3 Alien Wars on the Super NES. Contra hit arcades on February 20th. Remember a second ago when I said most people preferred the NES version of Contra over the arcade original? The same applies to Bionic Commando. Not that the arcade game was necessarily bad, but Capcom turned a solid concept into one of the best 8-bit action games ever made. The arcade original will be celebrating its 30th birthday in 2017. The NES game still has another year to go before it hits the 3-decade mark. Speaking of long-running franchises, Double Dragon will also be turning 30 in 2017. It spawned all kinds of sequels and spin-offs, including what appears to be a brand new installment coming in just a few weeks. Double Dragon originally hit Japanese arcades in August of 1987, and then 1 year later here in the United States. Another big franchise getting its start in 1987 was R-Type, which is one of my favorite 2D shoot-'em-ups. Although the game saw a worldwide release in 1987, it first hit Japanese arcades in July. My fear is that one of the best shooters of all time will be ignored on its 30th birthday. Look guys, we can't let that happen. 1987 was more than just first installments, as it also had its fair share of big-name sequels. One of the year's biggest sequels was 1943, the Battle of Midway, which hit arcades in June of 1987. This top-down shoot-'em-up tweaked the gameplay and added a fuel gauge, making it one of the best versions in this long-running series. The 1980s was a golden age for Sega arcade games, and 1987 saw more than a few memorable releases. Believe it or not, we actually saw 2 Afterburner games in 1987. The original game came out in July, and then the sequel followed just a few months later in October. Sega also published Super Hang-On that year, starting a trend Nintendo would later ape with their Super NES games. On the topic of sports games, Blades of Steel hit arcades in October of 1987. As somebody who didn't grow up watching hockey, this was my first exposure to the sport. Personally, I prefer the NES port, but that's not celebrating a big birthday in 2017. RoadBlasters is one of those old-school arcade games I couldn't get enough of as a kid. I put so much money into the machine that I'm a little surprised it didn't have a string of sequels. It was like OutRun with weapons. That should have been the biggest thing in 1987. There were all kinds of ports of the game, just never a sequel. That seems wrong. We can't talk about arcade games in the 1980s without mentioning at least one light gun shooter. Operation Wolf was kind of a big deal when it hit arcades in November of 1987. It had a cool gun you wanted to grab onto, and the fast-paced action helped suck you in. Apparently it did so well that it spawned a number of sequels, including Operation Thunderbolt in 1988, Operation Wolf 3 in 1994, and 1998's Operation Tiger. Moving away from the arcade scene, 1987 was the year the Nintendo Entertainment System really started to come into its own. Some of the industry's biggest franchises started that year, including Mega Man. This was one of the few 8-bit games to get a near-simultaneous launch worldwide, with almost all versions hitting stores in December of 1987. Brazil didn't get a taste of Mega Man until 1994, but that's a whole nother story. 1987 was also the year a lot of gamers got a taste of Final Fantasy. Well, Japanese gamers. The role-playing game didn't launch until 1990 in the United States, but it was a solid hit 3 years earlier in Japan. If celebrating the Japanese release date seems weird, then you're gonna hate the rest of this NES list. I say that because Dragon Quest II also came out in 1987, in Japan. Much like Final Fantasy, this old-school RPG, known as Dragon Warrior 2 in the United States, didn't get an English port until 1990. I recommend celebrating the anniversary on January 26 to honor the very first release, and then throwing another party 3 years later, if you remember. Another January date you should keep track of is the 14th, when The Adventure of Link Zelda 2 will be celebrating its 30th birthday. Once again, this hit Japan a year before the US, but that's not going to stop me from including it here on this list. Instead of fretting over which version came out when, I recommend you get the party supplies right now because January 14th is just around the corner. Castlevania 2 Simon's Quest is yet another example of the Japanese getting games first. While kind of a crummy sequel, this open-world adventure game first hit the Japanese Famicom on August 28, 1987, long before the botched English translation. I always loved the ambition of this sequel, but kinda hate the execution. It's definitely worth remembering this coming August. If you're the type of person who wants to celebrate American release dates, then we can go the other direction with the original Castlevania. First released on September 26, 1986 in Japan, American gamers finally got their hands on this classic in May of 1987. And it's not just Castlevania, but also Kid Icarus. Here's another 8-bit action game that first hit Japan in 1986 and then was ported to the States in 1987. Thankfully, there were a lot of great games released in Japan and the United States in the same year, such as Rad Racer. This speedy racing game first hit Japan on August 7th, followed a couple months later by the NES version in October. Which date you choose to celebrate is entirely up to you. The same goes for 3D WorldRunner, which launched in Japan in March and then in the United States in September. Of course, there's a good chance you're not even going to bother celebrating this anniversary, because I think I'm the only one with nostalgia for this 8-bitter. Did I mention that Goonies 2 will also be hitting the US and Japan in 1987? Like always, the Japanese got their version first, on March 18th. American gamers, on the other hand, had to wait until November before tracking down that pesky mermaid. If you've been looking for a reason to play Mike Tyson's Punch-Out, then maybe the game's 30th anniversary will light a fire under your butt. The game hit retailers in October of 1987, but I recommend you start practicing right now. I mean it. Mike Tyson doesn't care if it's the 30th anniversary, he just wants to knock you out. Star Wars fans have a lot of reasons to be excited for December 2017. There's a new movie coming, more toys to collect, and more TV commercials than you can shake a lightsaber at. Perhaps you should add December 4th to that list, because that's the day Namco's Star Wars game came out in Japan. This is one of those rare movie games that didn't make its way west, forever forced to be played with Japanese text. Just imagine if the next Star Wars movie only came out in Japan. Oh man, the world would explode. It wasn't just the Nintendo Entertainment System that was having a great year, because some pretty incredible carts came to the Sega Master System in 1987. Perhaps the biggest was Phantasy Star, which hit Japanese retailers in December, followed by the American version in 1988. The Master System also saw the release of OutRun on June 30th. This is one of the better 8-bit racing games, and a strong reminder of why people bought the Master System. Almost the exact same thing can be said about the Ghostbusters game, which came out in 1987 and is arguably the best game based off of the hit movie. As we near the end of this list, it's probably worth remembering that there was a lot more to gaming than consoles and arcade hits. Computers like the Commodore 64, MSX, and Apple II may not have been getting all the attention, but there were still great games hitting the various platforms. This includes Leisure Suit Larry in the Land of the Lounge Lizards, which hit personal computers on July 5th, 1987. This introduced the world to a character who would find his way into 6 more games, not to mention a 2013 remake. On the topic of point-and-click adventure games, Maniac Mansion will also be celebrating its 30th birthday in 2017. This was Lucasfilm Games in their prime, producing some of the funniest games in the 1980s. Maniac Mansion first hit Apple II and C64 on October 5th, which gives Double Fine more than enough time to announce a much-needed remake. And finally, no list would be complete without the mention of one of the greatest video game spies of all time. Of course, I'm talking about Solid Snake, who made his first appearance in Metal Gear on the MSX in July of 1987. Little did anybody know that Snake would become so popular that Hideo Kojima would spend the next quarter century working on one sequel after another. But Metal Gear was a lot more innocent 30 years ago, and 2017 is a pretty good time to finally make your way through Snake's very first video game. And that was 1987. It was definitely a strong and varied year full of great games. What are your favorite games celebrating their 30th anniversary in 2017? Let me know in the comments, and stay tuned as we check in with 1992 and 1997 in upcoming episodes. For now, here's a salute to all the games turning 30 over the next 12 months.